All right, it's 11:30, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Lori Dunagan. I think I know most of you, but in case not, I am one of the productivity coaches with the PC program. And Brittany normally does the weekly workshop. And the first Monday of every month, I will be doing one based on contracts. So today we are going to be talking about the seller in possession, or the SIP form. And we are also going to talk about the seller purchase of replacement property, which is the SPRP form. I am going to be sharing my screen, and when I share my screen, I can't necessarily see everybody. And so if you guys have any questions as we're going along, please feel free to ask them. I do like my workshops to be interactive, and I like questions, but don't just raise your hand because I might not see you. That being said, if you are able to, go ahead and turn on your cameras because it makes it a little bit easier to be interactive as a group when I can see who I'm speaking with. Have you guys used the seller in possession form before?
No.
We are, so over the last few months, we've been in a place where the buyers have had a little bit more power than what they had had over the last 2 years. And now we're shifting back to where the buyers are losing some of that power. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot is the seller in possession form in play. And so that's part of the reason why I wanted to go ahead and discuss that form. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So give me just a second here. All right. So the seller in possession form, we use this form. So when you're filling out the RPA and you get to the section and it talks about when is the buyer going to take possession, usually, I mean, like in the RPA, it just defaults to at close of escrow. But sometimes the seller wants to stay for a few more days. And so that's when the seller in possession form would come into play. This form is used if the possession term is going to be less than 29 days. If it's going to be longer than 29 days, then there's a different form that gets used, and that form is much more involved than this seller in possession. So when possible, I try to make it so that it's less than 29 days. So with this form, the first thing you're going to do, of course, is just fill out the top of it, and it's either going to be an addendum to the purchase agreement or to the counteroffer, either the buyer counteroffer or the seller counteroffer. Now, one thing that we see sometimes is in the counteroffer stage, they might just put the terms in the counteroffer and not actually use this form. And so the counteroffer might say something like seller to stay in possession for 10 days after close of escrow at no cost to seller. And while that's essentially the gist of this form, we want to actually use this form because this form specifies some additional details that could be pain points between buyer and seller if certain things arise. And so we'll talk about some of those as we go. I always like to talk about managing our clients' expectations, and I like to talk about the different risks associated with different parts of a transaction. And so the first part, just basic information, their names, all of that. One of the things that I want to point out on this form is that it's a license to remain in possession of the home. So it's not like rent. So nothing in here is calling anything rent. And it gives us a disclaimer here that, let me see. Buyer is advised to consult with a qualified local landlord attorney to discuss whether the possession could be interpreted as creating a landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller. So even though they are trying to use language that implies it's not a landlord-tenant relationship, the actual rules might indicate that it is, right? And so with a landlord-tenant relationship, what that means is then tenant rights kick into place. And, if you guys are familiar with California tenant rights at all, tenants have a lot of rights. And when a buyer or seller are entering into this agreement, it's not really intended to be like a landlord seller thing. It's just intended to be, hey, I need a few more days to pack my stuff and get moved. But we just have to be careful about what laws come into place inadvertently, right? And so what we want to do, the first thing that we're going to fill out is the term. And so under the terms, we're going to identify either how many days they can stay after the close of escrow or a specific date that they can stay. So it's common to see both. But again, if it's a specific date, we want it to be less than the 29 days. But if they need, like, let's say they need a week to move out and we put a specific date and then escrow closes late, that lessens their week. So usually it's a good idea to put specific days here. And then it defaults to 6 p.m. I kind of like to just put it till midnight on whatever day it is that they're going to move out, just because that way my buyer or even the seller knows that they have that entire day and you'll just get it the next day, right? And that way, if they're a little bit late getting out, they're getting out at 2 a.m. and our client probably doesn't care about 2 a.m. But if it's at 6 o'clock in the evening, they might actually care, right? But it can be either way. And then it does say seller has no right to remain in possession beyond this term and may be responsible for court awarded damages if seller does remain. And so what that language is telling us is if the seller remains in possession longer than what they're supposed to, we're probably going to have to take them to court and get them evicted, unless it's just, a day or whatever, not as big of a deal. I mean, you'll have clients angry if it's longer than the specified term, but that's one of the risks with this form, or it's a risk with allowing a seller to stay in possession, because if the seller ends up not moving for whatever reason, then there's a whole court process and eviction process that comes into play. And when your buyer is buying their new house, they're not thinking, oh, we're going to end up in court trying to get the seller out, right? And that's why it's safer to have the seller out at close of escrow. But again, sellers are having a little bit more power. And so this request for them to stay has been a lot more common. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, good. So the risk of letting the seller stay is that potentially they don't end up moving out when they're supposed to, right? But what's the risk if we don't allow them to stay? Anyone know what that risk would be?
That they wouldn't accept the offer in the first place.
They wouldn't accept the offer. And so if, as agents, it's very important that we are not trying to determine the level of risk that our client is willing to take. That decision is completely up to our buyer, but our buyer, it is our job to identify the pros and cons to the buyer, right? So that the buyer is fully aware of what could happen both ways. And I would say, I don't have any percentages. I would say most sellers move out when they're supposed to. It's just, one or two ruin it for the rest of them, right? Okay, so then let's talk about consideration. If we are going to let the seller stay for, let's say, an extra 10 days, are we charging them any fee for letting them stay? Because the new buyer is going to have, 10 days worth of mortgage payment that they're going to have to pay. And so are they paying that and not getting the benefit of the house? Or are they charging the seller a fee while they're in there? And because house prices continue to go up, if they are charging a fee, my assumption is you would want to take the buyer's new mortgage payment, divide it by, a daily rate, multiply it by the 10 days that they're going to be there and charge, the full amount. But keep in mind, the seller doesn't have that same mortgage payment. And so it's going to be an increase for the seller, which may or may not be a bad thing. But what we are seeing a lot is sellers are saying, I want to stay for 10 days and I don't want to pay for those 10 days. And so that's a negotiation point, right? And what is your buyer willing to accept or not accept? And then it does say it's a non-refundable license fee to stay. Again, it does not call it rent. And we can choose an amount either per day, or we can choose a flat amount. And then I would mark this box right here that says it's held in escrow. So let's say we're going to charge $2,000 for the seller to stay for, whatever amount of time it is. We don't want that released to the buyer, because then when the seller moves out, the buyer has to pay it back to the seller. So we just want it held in escrow, and then escrow can handle that. And if they're letting them stay for no cost, then there would be no dollar amount written here, and they would just stay for free. There is a part here about for late charges, non-sufficient funds if they're paying with a check. But if we're holding that in escrow and we're identifying a dollar amount up front, we don't really have to worry too much about that, right? But here's a part that comes into play that's really important, is the seller's obligation for the condition of the property, right? Now, generally speaking, when a buyer buys a house, you can kind of tell what type of condition the seller has kept their house in. Have they maintained it? Have they not? But this is specifying that the seller has to maintain the property. And let's see, the pool, the spa, the landscaping, the grounds, any personal property that's included in the sale in substantially the same condition as it was on the date of the agreement, right? And that makes sense. And so they're agreeing to that. And then the other thing that they can agree on is there a delivery of possession fee? And so in my mind, the delivery of possession fee is similar to a deposit, like a security deposit. So this is saying that, yes, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I will let you stay in the house after we close escrow, but I want escrow to hold X amount of dollars, let's say $5,000, so that I can guarantee that you move out when you're supposed to, and you leave the house in the condition that you're supposed to. And so again, if you do that, I would have that held in escrow. And so that's something to consider doing. Any questions on that? Okay.
I as far as getting offers accepted, I guess you'd have to talk to them prior to that is that going to deter them at all?
The buyer or the seller?
The seller. If you're in.
It's something that you could discuss with the agent and let them know that you're putting that in there. But I think if you explain the reason why, they should be pretty, understanding of it. And
Right.
If they're only staying, let's say they're going to stay 10 days, they're getting that money back at the end of the 10 days, right? Now, it does raise a potential issue of, okay, so you're going to hold, X amount of dollars in escrow just to ensure I leave the house in the right condition. When I move out, sometimes when buyers move in there, they can be, very particular about things. And maybe they then say, well, I'm not giving the money back because blah, blah, blah. And so it could potentially raise issues, but it also just serves as a sense of security for the buyer when you're looking at the other things. So everything's negotiable, and each buyer and each seller is going to have a different opinion on what they're willing to or not do, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. And then utilities, a seller agrees to pay for all utilities, which makes sense because the seller is just continuing to live there, right? Then we have the issue of entry. Is the new property owner, the buyer, are they allowed to enter the property after it closes? And this says, yes, they are, with 24-hour notice, but they're not allowed to move any of their personal belongings in. So even though they now own this new home, they can't take possession of it or move anything into it until the seller is out, until this, the term that agreed upon here is over. Because sometimes they might think, well, I can just move my stuff into the garage, or whatever. And that's not the case. Of course, any of these terms could be changed with an addendum, but we're just talking about standard language in the form. It talks about keys. Does the new owner get the keys at the close of escrow, or do they get it at the end of the seller in possession term? And that could go either way. No assignment or subletting. So seller's not allowed to, let anyone else move in or, sublet the property while they've got this term. And then insurance. And I like that the insurance is on here, and it gives you an opportunity to discuss it with your client, because once possession of the home, or once ownership of the home, I should say, so ownership of the home changes at the close of escrow, right? Even if possession doesn't, ownership does. And so at that point, the seller who has been living there had homeowner's insurance, right? But now when escrow closes, they no longer own the home, so they're no longer eligible for homeowner's insurance. But they're still going to live there for 10 days, right? And so what happens if, there's a fire or something in those 10 days, and, all of their furniture and belongings were to be damaged, right? They have no homeowner's insurance. So the seller might want to, and I don't even know if you can get it for 10 days or whatever time period, but they might want to talk to their insurance company and see if they can get renter's insurance, because essentially they're renting the property for the 10 days, right? I've never talked to an insurance person, so I don't really know exactly how this works, but it's something to bring up, to your clients and make them aware of, so that they can find out, what they're comfortable doing.
So Lori,
yes.
Just to clarify that. So the buyer in that case, if there were fire, and what if the buyer has insurance? They've already bought insurance, even though the sellers are still living in the property. Mm-hmm. The sellers don't have the insurance. So the buyer, even though they do have the insurance, would not be liable for any of those damages. Is that
correct?
Okay. So then it's a good idea to make sure that the seller understands, if you're going to be staying in the property as a renter, then you need to protect your property and buy some insurance, if hopefully that can be possible.
Yeah. And I like that you put renter in quotes, because that's not specifically the right term, but it's how we would describe them.
Right.
So once close of escrow happens, especially if the new buyer is getting a loan, they have to have homeowner's insurance, right? Their lender's going to require. So at the close of escrow, even though they haven't moved in yet, they have homeowner's insurance. And so if there's a fire or something, that protects the home, but it does not protect the seller's property. And in fact, I don't even think that they're allowed to reimburse the seller for that, but I don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know how that works. You'd want to talk to an insurance company, but yes, the seller's stuff would not be covered in that scenario.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And so when we get like a counteroffer and they're not incorporating this form, and it just says seller to remain in possession for X number of days, whatever, like these are issues that nobody's like necessarily thinking about, right? Which is why we want to use this form, because it brings the issues up. But here's the risk. So what if you bought a house and you let the seller stay for 10 days, and then on day 3, there was a fire, or, you'd be really upset about that, right? I mean, even in any scenario, you'd be really upset about that. But here's another question, and I don't know the answer to this, but what if there's like a major plumbing pipe that bursts and the home floods, right? Who's responsible for paying for that? Is it the seller, because they're supposed to deliver the property in essentially the same condition as it was in, although this is just talking about in 3A, it's just talking about, general maintenance stuff. But is it the seller, or is it the new owner? I mean, the new owner has a homeowner's insurance, so I'm sure that would kick in. But like, these are things that you have to think about, because they're things that are unlikely to happen, but could happen. And in that point, even that, it's like, well, then was that something that, like there's a whole other host of questions that could be risen by that. But yeah, so that's pretty much this form. Do you guys have any questions on it? Oh, so one other thing in here, and this is in the purchase agreement too, but some people don't realize how it gets counted. But there's a counting of days in here. It's under the terms section right here. So right on here in number 1, it says that the counting of days starts. Well, it doesn't say it there. It says it somewhere else. But when let's say the seller gets to stay for 3 days, right? So close of escrow, the day that escrow closes is considered day 0. And then the next day is day 1, and then day 2, and then day 3. And so some people think that the day that escrow closes would be day 1, and it's not. And when you're in a transaction, you want to make sure that both parties have an understanding when we close of what the move out date is. And you would communicate that, through the other agent. And it says it right here. So it said right above term right here. Close of escrow shall be day 0 for purposes of counting days.
So Lori, I'm sorry,
mhm.
Lori, how does that work when you have weekends involved or holidays for that matter? Does it impact it at all?
Not in this case.
Okay.
Not in this case.
All right.
So you use this if you're only going under 29 days, right?
Yes, under 29 days.
And then after that, you should probably have a lease agreement.
Yes, there's a lease agreement. I think it's the RLAS form, and it says in the RPA, it gives you the option, the 2 different forms. The difference between this and the lease form, not like the only difference, but the lease form is like, I don't even know, maybe 4, 5, 6 pages. And this is 2 pages. The lease form gets a lot more involved in who's paying for what. It's more like it's a lease. So
Yeah,
it's more like
it covers a lot more liability stuff and
exactly.
insurance.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
All right. Okay, so this is the seller's purchase of replacement property. And so this form gets used when the seller is going to be purchasing a new home and doesn't want to end up homeless in the process. Does that make sense? Okay. And so this is one of those forms, just like the seller in possession form, that you want to have that incorporated and negotiated and agreed to before you go into escrow. So this should be an addendum to either the purchase agreement or a counteroffer form. And the top of it, filled out just like any other form. And then there's a couple of important things here. So first of all, there's I guess essentially 2 options, but kind of 3 options here. This could be a form that makes it dependent upon the seller finding a replacement property, or it could be that the seller has already entered into an agreement to purchase a new home. And if that's the case, you're going to mark box B here, and then you'll put the escrow holder and the escrow number, right? So obviously having them already be in contract is more powerful, or, a stronger position to be than have them looking for a home. If they're looking for a replacement property, the standard time frame from this contract is 17 days. So essentially it gives them 17 days to find their replacement property. And then that could be, at the end of the 17 days, if they have not found their replacement property, the buyer can either cancel the agreement, or seller and buyer could negotiate, and maybe they're going to give the seller, another week to find replacement property, or whatever the case might be. But by here, it's a standard 17 days. And then the other thing is this box C, and I feel like it's very important that box C is marked, because box C makes it also contingent upon the seller closing on the replacement property, because it's really not beneficial for a buyer to have for a seller to have a contingency to find a new home unless they actually close on that home, right? I review a lot of offers. I reviewed an offer this weekend where the seller's agent did not mark box 1C. And I'm like, I think that they did that in error, because they're not really protecting their seller without having that box marked. And so if we're representing the buyer, the risk of having the seller have the ability to close on the replacement property is that if they don't, so it can depend, right? So well, let me talk about, well, here we go, timeframes. Okay. So we have a choice in time periods here. One is that right when we go under escrow, buyer and seller goes under escrow, the time periods start. And that means, you know, you've got your standard 17-day inspection period or whatever's in the RPA. The other option is that none of those timeframes start until the seller has identified their replacement property. And that's the way that we want to write it up if we're representing a buyer, because if they never end up finding their replacement property, we don't want to have had our buyer start spending money on inspections and appraisals, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah, so we want to, so I always leave it the default language here that it starts the day after the seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the contingency, which is basically once they go under contract. But it's still risky. So even though we're going to eliminate some of our buyer's risk by having the time period start after the seller finds their replacement property, if the seller ends up not, you know, the seller's going to do their own inspections, and if something comes up and they can't come to terms and the seller ends up backing out of their replacement property, they have the ability to then cancel the contract with your buyer, and your buyer then is out without any fault of their own. They're out any money that they've spent on inspections and appraisals up to that point, right? Does that make sense? So having a seller have an SPRP, purchase a replacement property contingency is risky to your buyer, and your buyer needs to understand that they could potentially lose their inspection money if that scenario happens, right? But again, the risk on the other side of that is if they don't allow them to have this replacement property contingency, then their offer is probably not going to be accepted.
Okay, so we were talking about the seller having the contingency on finding another property and closing or not closing. But what if the seller is in that same situation, I guess, if you want to call it the same situation, they have a contingency as well where they need to sell their property to get the proceeds to purchase that seller's property. So what if the buyer can't close for some reason?
Yeah, same thing. So it becomes like a domino, you know, like this and then this and this, almost like a train where you have the 3 different cars. So at any time, so your buyer or the buyer in this scenario is going to also do their inspections. And if something comes up and they can't agree to it or they don't want the house, they can back out as long as they have their inspection contingency. And that leaves the seller in a bad position, because now the seller has no buyer, and that seller may have already started doing their inspections on their replacement property. And if that other party won't allow them to extend it, you know, have time to get another buyer, then that seller might be out their inspection costs and appraisal costs as well. So it's a risk on, you know, multiple entities.
Yeah, I could see how it's definitely a domino effect. It affects a lot of parties there.
It does affect a lot of parties. Yes.
Okay.
I have a question,
All right.
Lori.
Yeah, Joshua.
How often does a scenario like that happen where these contingencies like end up being used and basically escrow doesn't close and, you know, the buyers don't get the new home and all that? Like, how often does that happen?
I mean, I don't have any percentages, but I would say it happens, you know, often. It's going to be just like any other transaction where you know, even if there's none of these contingencies, if you just have a buyer who enters into a contract to buy a house, it's not super uncommon for that transaction not to go through. And so whether you've got, you know, multiple other parties involved, it still might not go through.
I see.
And that's why, so it's this balance. Like, I don't want to scare my buyers and sellers, but I want them to have full awareness of what could happen that they could end up losing their inspection costs, because I don't want that to happen and then for them to get upset with me as their agent because I didn't warn them. But again, it goes back to there's that risk, but the risk of the flip side of that is they don't accept your offer because you're not willing to take that risk, right? So time periods. So we're going to have them ideally start after they go after the seller finds their replacement property, and then same with the buyer's deposit. There is an option in here that you guys can negotiate right up front. And this says that we're giving the seller permission to extend the close of escrow date by X number of days or until a certain date, just by giving the buyer written notice. Usually when I fill these out, I just leave this blank, and it's never been an issue with it being blank. And if something came up and it needed to be extended, that'd be something that buyer and seller could negotiate. Maybe they'd be willing to, maybe they're not. One of the things to keep in mind with a buyer is that if this keeps, so as a buyer, right off the bat, we're going to say, okay, seller, you have 17 days to find a replacement property. And then we're going to do our 30-day escrow, right? So that's 47 days. And then if the seller finds a buyer, if the seller goes into contract, but they need longer days, anyways, it could extend out past 45 days, right? Well, then you have to take into consideration of your lender, the buyer's lender is going to at some point want to lock in the rate, and they can only lock it in within a certain time frame. So if we're like, 47 days out, they probably can't lock it in yet. And then we don't know what interest rates are going to do, 45 days from now. And if we extend it even longer, there's still that, unknown. And so there's those types of things to take into consideration as well. Maybe and maybe not, might be a big deal, might not be a big deal. I think last year when interest rates just really kept going up, it was probably a bigger deal than it is now. But yeah. And then if there's any other terms you want to write, you can write in there. And so, yeah, that's pretty much this form. This last part is just saying that if the seller does not identify the property within 17 days, that the buyer can give them a notice to perform and then back out of the contract. So any questions on that? So that's the two forms that I wanted to go over today. And so we went over them kind of quickly. And so essentially, if you guys don't have no questions, that would end the workshop right now. But instead of, and we can definitely end it, but if anyone wants to ask questions about anything else or different scenarios on when we would use these forms, like I'm here. So like, let me know.
So, a suggestion, if you had somebody in that situation, I'm going into an early consult as a buyer, or somebody that needs to sell their house and buy their house, what's the conversation that you have with them? So like in that situation, like, I just talked to somebody that's like, well, if you do sell your house, we can add an addendum to where you don't have to move out until you find another house, et cetera, et cetera. You bring that up, and then when you make the offer, you put that addendum in if that's what they need.
Yeah. And so I wouldn't say it's quite the way you just phrased it, because it's not going to be that you don't have to move out until you find a replacement property. Because that just makes it sound like it's an unlimited amount of time for them to search for their new property, right?
Right.
So as you can see, both of these forms have specific timelines. And so it's more along the lines of you'll have 17 days once you go under contract to identify your replacement property. And then if you need time to move out after that, then you can have, up to 29 days. It's all negotiable though, right? But here's the thing. So a lot of times a seller doesn't want to put their home on the market until they've identified their replacement property, right? But what does that do for their negotiating power?
It doesn't help them. It weakens it.
It weakens it, right?
Yeah.
Because let's say a seller finds the perfect house that they want, and they're going to put in an offer, but they're going to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. other seller, I want you to take my offer, but I still have to sell my house, and I haven't even put my house on the market yet. And I still need to, identify what price I'm going to put it at. And I still need to take photos, and I still need to then, do all this stuff. Right. The other seller is going to be like, wait a minute, there's another buyer here that already has everything in place. It's not contingent on them selling their house. Like, why would I take your offer and not their offer? Right.
Right.
Well, the only way to get this offer accepted then is to make it a sweeter offer by offering more money, right? And so it's just a really bad place to be, but sellers don't understand that, and they want to find their replacement property first. And that's why it's important to show them these forms and say, look, you'll have 17 days to find your replacement property. And if you don't find it, then we can get back out of the contract. Right. Or we can ask for longer days. But yeah.
Well, even on the back end too, when if you wait, like find the house that you want to buy and then wait to sell yours, you got to take the best offer because you're motivated and got to get out of there. So you might lose value on the home that you're selling.
Exactly. Exactly. It puts you in more of a desperate
Right.
situation.
Right. Motivated seller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And so those are things, as real estate agents, we are educators. And so that's where we need to educate our clients. And a lot of times clients make decisions based off of fear. And that's where these forms can address the fear that they have by the use of these contingencies. Because the last thing that we're going to do is let our clients end up homeless, right? And so, like I said, when I reviewed the offer this weekend, where the seller's agent had forgot to mark the box saying that it was also contingent upon them closing on their replacement property, like that was a big mistake, right? Because it doesn't do them any good to go under contract on a new home if there's not also that contingency that they're going to close on it. So what's the best case scenario in that when you guys get an offer and you can see that the agent probably forgot to mark a box that protects their client? Do we just think, score, that's great for our buyer?
No, I think we immediately call that agent and ask for confirmation.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we should do, right?
But we're going to have to either way eventually.
Yeah, I mean, because again, we want to, manage our clients' expectations. And it's like, I can point out to the client, hey, they didn't mark this box. I'm pretty sure they meant to mark this box. So if this comes up later on, we've got to go under the assumption that they meant to mark this box. Mm-hmm. And so what we're talking about a little bit is there's two contingencies. So if a seller is selling their house and they're buying another house, there's a special contingency you're going to want to use on both sides of the transaction. So there's the seller purchase of replacement property contingency, which we just talked about. And that's going to be when they receive an offer, they are going to want to make sure that they counter back and say, hey, this is contingent on us finding a replacement property, right? But when they submit an offer on the replacement property, they want to use another form, and it's called, does anyone know what it's called?
SIP.
Nope, not that one, because that's to say that's staying in possession. It's the one so that they only have to buy the, wait, I confused myself. Do you guys ever confuse yourself? Okay, there's the seller purchase of replacement property, and then I want to say it's called the COP, but I could be wrong on that. Let me look right here.
That sounds right.
It's the contingency of
purchase, contingency on purpose. The COP is what it is.
Contingency for sale of buyer's property.
So it is.
So when they're buying this property, they've got another contingency with that property seller saying that they only have to buy if they actually sell their existing property. And so,
okay.
So make sure if you're ever representing somebody who's buying and selling that you've got contingencies on both sides of their transaction that's protecting them. In fact, we could have went over that form, but I don't have it up in. You guys want to go over that form really quick? Let's go over that really quick.
Come on, somebody say yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And let me go back. And this is the COP. There's so many acronyms, sometimes it's hard to remember what's what. Okay, so this is the contingencies for sale of buyer's property.
That's it.
Yep, and again, so this is going to be negotiated in the very front of the transaction, so it's going to be part of the purchase agreement. And this one I did.
What's hard to remember is the contingent. Yeah, it's just a contingency date removals happening. Thank goodness for TCs.
Yeah, well, and you should calendar that stuff. So anytime you go into a transaction, if you know that the inspection period's after 17 days, go into your calendar and write day 17 of whatever transaction. So that way, as you're going through your calendar, you know what's coming up. But yes,
yeah, and
transaction coordinators are really nice. Okay, so let me see. It's addendum to the purchase agreement between the buyer and the seller. It's got the buyer's property here, buyer's property contingency. So this agreement is contingent upon the buyer entering into a contract for the sale and closing on buyer's property. Okay, so that means it's so funny because we're talking about like one person who's a seller on this side and a buyer on this side. And so it kind of gets a little bit confusing, but basically this is for the sale of the buyer's property. And so there's two choices here. Again, either it's contingent upon them entering into the contract or closing on it. And we want to make sure that, only entering into a contract. Okay, so that doesn't do us no good because we don't want it contingent on them just entering into a contract. We want it to be contingent on them closing. Okay, so this says buyer shall have 17 days after acceptance to enter into a contract for the sale of buyer's property. So it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, but it's reversed. So in this case, the buyer is purchasing a home, but they're saying, I want to purchase your home, but in order to purchase your home, I have to sell my existing property. And so this is saying, I will find a buyer for my property within 17 days. Right. So buyer has signed a listing agreement for buyer's property. So they're talking about the buyer that's buying the next property, but they're talking about the listing agreement on their existing property. Okay, that's the piece I got confused on. And so they're saying that the buyer has either already signed the listing agreement or will be signing it. Now, the reason that we want the buyer to have already signed the listing agreement and ideally already have it on the market is because if you're going to go under contract with someone that's going to sell their house, you want to know if they're being realistic about it or not, right? So are they pricing their home competitively? Are they overpricing their home? Because I don't want to tie my house up with a buyer who's being unrealistic about how much they think they can sell their house for, right? And so if they haven't even signed a listing agreement yet, or it's not on the market yet, then we don't know what they're going to list it at. But if it's already on the market, then we know and we can say, okay, that seems realistic that they can sell it within, the 17 days. So that's where you want to have it already on the market. And then usually, so close of escrow of buyer's property, we usually want that to happen, or it usually has to happen at the same time, because the buyer usually needs the money from their house to purchase the next house. This says that the buyer will keep the listing agent in, or the seller of their next home informed. And so if it falls out of escrow for any reason, they are obligated to let the seller know, and they have 2 days to do that. If it gets canceled, that's what this is, a cancellation. But here's what's really important on this form. So if I didn't tell you guys anything else about this form, this is what I want to tell you. When a seller enters into contract with a buyer who has to sell their house, they are able to take backup offers. And if they find a backup offer that they like better than the existing offer, this says that they can essentially cancel the contract with the existing buyer and go into a new one with the new buyer that has a better offer, right? But we have some options. So they can either do that immediately, or, so that's what this right here is immediate right to notify buyer. So at any time, if the seller finds a better buyer, they can just say, hey, guess what? We found a better buyer and we're going to cancel on you. Or there's a delayed right. And this says that for the first 17 days, they cannot cancel on me and go under contract with a better buyer. And, you know, the word better, it just means a stronger offer until 17 days, right? But here's the one that we want to mark. We want to make sure when we're using this form that we are protecting our client by marking 3C. And this says that the seller shall not have the right to invoke the provisions of paragraph 7B, which I'll read to you in a minute, during the entire time of the agreement. And so what 7B says is that it says that if seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified, seller shall have the right to give a written notice to buyer in writing to either remove this contingency that allows them to sell their house, or remove the loan contingency, or provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow. Usually a buyer is not going to be in a position to do any of those things. And so that's why we want to mark 3C, because 3C takes away the right of the seller to make them do those things. And so again, I think that pretty much the most important thing on this form is that this 3C box gets marked. Here's the other thing, and we only have 4 minutes. So this is a contingency for sale of buyer's property. This form, if your buyer is able to buy their next house without selling their existing house, you don't want to use this form, because what this form does right here on number 9 is it gives the seller a number of ways that they can cancel the agreement with your buyer. Now, under a normal transaction, a seller cannot cancel an agreement, right? And so if you use this form, it gives the seller a little bit more power than what they normally have. So if your buyer is technically able to buy the next property without selling their existing one, then you might consider doing it without using this form. Of course, there's, you know, risks either way with that. Okay,
Lori,
so yes.
just real quick. But what you're saying is essentially, if the buyer does not have a choice, they need those proceeds from their home, a sale of their home, to buy that new property. You can't avoid this.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
But make sure 3C or 7C3 is marked.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay.
I just want to say thank you so much, Lori, because in this short period of time, you've really given us a lot of great information if these situations do come up. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And here's the thing. My suggestion is to take these forms, print them out, and, you know, practice filling them out, reading them, understanding what they say. Really, it won't be until you get into a transaction when you need to use these forms that it'll really like click on what you need to do. But now at least you have some familiarity with them. And so maybe it won't be as overwhelming when you encounter them the first time.
Thank you, Lori.
You're welcome. All right, guys, have a great day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.